Right. So let's start. We'll be looking at learning outcome, 5 today, which is primarily, the role of the human resources department within an organization. And this is something that I think we should be all able to relate to because most of us are working at start. So good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining. We're going to be starting, the Learning Outcome 5 today, as you can see, which is primarily, about the role of human resources department in any organization. This is something that most of us are aware, and obviously, I think we should be able to relate to the key functions of the human resources department in any organization. Now, it's an interesting learning outcome to discuss today because of the fact that most of us work within organizations, businesses, or have worked at least, in some place or the other. And we understand that when we talk about things like your salary, your contract, your time, employee handbook, looking at certain important bits of legislation, which is employee legislation, things like the Minimum Wage Act, looking at, maternity leave, or looking at the disciplinary process. There are lots of different bits that we have gone through as, an employee or as a part-time employee or, even a supply worker in most organizations. So this bit that we look at, is going to be quite useful, primarily because of the fact that it will shed some light on what you have experienced in terms of interactions, and obviously how you've been, absorbed or had an induction absorbed within an organization, or the other way to put it is how you have gone through the induction within an organization. And that would, be something that we will discuss today. Now, when we talk about, bits and pieces in terms of looking at, I would say, let me just admit everybody. So great. So when we look at, bits and pieces of how different functions are carried out in the human resources department, what are the various pieces of legislation or rules and regulations which every human resource manager or person, officer working within the organization has to look at and follow, and then what are the benefits these legislation, rules and regulation or acts, which is essentially are there, are how they are beneficial to the employees and to the employer. And in the distinction criteria, we're looking at basically understanding the impact of employment legislation on a named business. So the distinction will primarily be an extension of your merit task, which is the benefits of legislation, and the assessment criteria 5.2, which basically talks about outlining the key features of employment legislation. But for the distinction criteria, what we'll be required to do is essentially talk about this in a named country. So we will discuss this from a point of view of United Kingdom or England in specific, England and Wales in specific, and that would help you accomplish this particular task. Now, there is a fair bit of indicative content to be covered in this particular learning outcome, which is learning outcome 5. And we'll be discussing, things on what is the functions of HR department, things like when we talk about functions, we look at basically, recruitment, selection, we look at the process of training, we look at, benefits, remuneration, look at leave, payroll in some cases if the HR and, payroll department are combined. Otherwise, generally payroll tends to be within accounts and finance. We'll also be looking at how people are recruited within the company. Sometimes we'll also be looking at, HR department or people within the organization look at the process of advertising or recruiting, placing adverts with recruitment agencies, which help in the process of recruitment or filling up vacancies within an organization. And under the employment procedure, and acts, we will be looking at a lot of different types of acts, which will include things like Minimum Wage Act, Working Time Directive, looking at sick pay, looking at unions, the ACAS procedure in particular, and also some of the key acts which we as employees, when we work within a business organization or a company are expected to get in terms of benefits when we work for an employer, because you're working and completing some roles and responsibilities, and in return you're looking at getting paid at the end of the month on time, and also ensuring that you get the associated benefits of working within an organization. So all those bits are going to be discussed in the employment legislation. Now, if I switch over to obviously the PowerPoint presentation, which we will use for the discussion of this particular learning outcome, as you would see, there are 4 bits that we have to cover. And these 4 typically would be the functions of HR first. Then we look at employment legislation, and the other 2 activities, which are predominantly merit and distinction, are an extension of what we discuss in terms of acts and regulation for the employment legislation. Now, does everybody understand what is the full form of HRM? What is HRM? Anybody? What is HRM? Any ideas? Okay, human resources management. As I've been saying the word human resources management. So HRM basically stands, for human resources management. And when we talk about, HR, there are lots of different functions within the HR that we are going to be looking at today. So key functions that we can think of, if you put on your thinking hat now and think as if you're working within a particular company and your role is of an HR officer, what are the key bits that you are going to be looking at doing when you work within human resources? You're looking at recruitment, you're looking at selection, you're also looking at doing interviews, which is all a part of recruitment and selection. So making a job description, putting a job advert, speaking to an agency, shortlisting the candidates, doing the interview. And once the interview is done and you prepare a shortlist, you're then going to be looking at issuing contracts. And once the employee admits or takes the contract, then you're looking at, inducting the employee into the organization, maybe a bit of induction, enrollment, introduction, which is given. You issue an employee handbook. And these are the bits that you would normally do when you work as an HR officer for a company, and they would be all falling under what is called recruitment and selection. Now, if you take that process a bit forward, you think about 6 months or 1 year in advance, and look at forward, 1 year forward. What will happen is that employee will become a part and parcel of the organization, would start performing. Towards the end of the year, you'll be looking at doing performance appraisal. How has the employee done in terms of roles and responsibilities, whether they have completed their goals, whether they have been helpful in achieving the objectives of the organization, have they been punctual, how many leaves they've taken. So basically, you'll go through the process of what is called appraisals. And appraising a candidate towards the end of the calendar year or financial year would basically help you to understand whether the employee is working to the job description provided. Is the employee making contributions towards the organization and fulfillment of his objective? And if the employee is making and taking interest and obviously is performing well in the job, then they could be also in line to receive a bonus or an incentive. Or if they've been working in the organization for a couple of years, depending on how the policy is within the organization, they might also be due for a promotion. Now, that particular part, which happens once a year, typically falls into what is called appraisals and performance appraisals. So this is another function of HR which people working within the human resources department do. Then we talk about, compensation, emoluments, or remuneration. We use the word circa, here in the UK. And obviously what we mean by that is that when you offer an employee a job contract, what tends to happen is you're basically offering him a certain remuneration or compensation. And this could be a combination of some annual benefits, a basic salary, some bonus incentive structure, and then some annual benefits, which could be things like dental care or maybe 20 plus 8 days, national holidays, some pension plan. These will all be part and parcel of what is called the compensation and will be depicted in what is called the employment contract. Now, this is also one of the key functions of HR, or when you work as an HR officer or as an HR manager or somebody who's working within the department, managing human resources would be required to do. And then there are lots of basic functions which the HR would do, and these would typically be, things like administration. So when I talk about administration, what we are looking at is they would be looking at essentially taking care of things like basic guidelines, regulations which have to be acted, and made sure that the regulations are being followed. They are looking at obviously grievance procedures, assuming if you're not happy with your boss and you make a complaint, or if you're being intimidated, assuming you feel unsafe by working within the department, or your boss shouts at you. These are instances wherein you would basically raise it with the HR manager or the HR officer, and they will be classed as what are called grievances. Now, if you feel that they have not been resolved within the organization, then in those cases, what will happen is you might want to take it to a union representative. You might want to take it to an outside authority, and they would be processed, through something called the ACAS procedure. And the ACAS procedure tends to be, a body which is outside, the organization, and they would be looking at, essentially resolving that dispute. So ACAS stands for Advisory, Conciliation, and Arbitration Service. Now, sometimes problems and issues, if you're not able to resolve these issues within the organization, then in those cases, what tends to happen is that you take it to the non-departmental or non-governmental body, and that tends to be what is called ACAS, and they will basically then adjudicate the matter on your behalf with the company and then help you get a resolution. Now, these are some of the very basic functions of what HR or human resources people working within the HR side would be expected to, do. Now, the HR is also tasked with a lot of other functions, which could include things like, looking at ensuring that every employee follows a bit of decorum, respects the culture within the organization, understands the vision and mission of why the organization of the business is set up, what is their objective, what policies and procedures need to be followed on a day in, day out basis while running and let's say fulfilling their roles and responsibilities. And to a certain extent, HR is also responsible for ensuring training and development. So training means at the end of the year, when your performance happens, appraisal happens, and they feel that you're not meeting the performance criteria which has been set, then the managers or your boss would recommend that the person needs to be put into a training. And that could be a training to help you do more sales, maybe networking, could be handling telephone calls, could be working with large teams. And it would basically be dependent on what has been the areas of gap or areas in which they feel that they would need to ensure that given the right amount of training, which allows you to develop skills or get the knowledge and know-how, you would be able to perform good or better in your job. And in that aspect, what tends to happen is that the HR part also, basically wants you to be able to perform better in your role. And that is what also, the HR side of things would be responsible for. Now, there are loads of other functions which HR could also do. They could be looking at maintaining certain governmental policies, implementation of some of these policies within, the organization, and they could be related to the fact that they have to ensure that everybody which is working within the organization is safe working environment is being provided. And in some cases, what they will also be looking at is maintaining relations between the management and also, you as an individual, which works, essentially, in relation to making sure that you're able to execute and work through all your responsibilities, properly. Now, when we also look at the main, let's say, functions which HR would do, depending on the size and scale of the organization, these would tend to be the main types that we have classified, under these 4 broad headings. I can further classify them, into different headings, and they can be done, depending on what is the size and scale of the organization and, what kind of employees work within a particular business or an organization. Sometimes you would see the HR also looks at maintaining what are called labor laws and relations related to government legislation. That there is somebody who also would be looking into key compliances say, for example, we were working within, we were a part of the EU a few years back, and obviously a lot of EU workers or migrant workers were coming to the UK for the purposes of working and, you know, taking up employment. So in that context, what you would generally see is that we, the HR side of things, if your business was employing EU workers or was having branch offices in the European Union or other countries, then obviously you need to ensure that you are able to maintain, understand, and uphold the legislations which are required to work and, you know, employ people or labor, essentially, I would say, in other countries or in other places. This is because if you do not conform to these guidelines, sometimes what tends to happen is that you are fined because you have not met the guideline and you know, the minimum acts and legislation which have been, you know, provided, you know, essentially, you know, with details in terms of what regulations have to be followed. So they would essentially be looking at, you know, basically making sure that these compliances are upheld, and essentially these compliances, you know, also save money for the employer. Because if I look at giving an example of UK, that if you employ somebody who's not authorized to work in the UK, the HMRC and the Home Office can fine the business £20,000. Now, this is a liability which obviously the company will need to pay, because they've employed somebody who's not, you know, entitled to work within the UK or have recourse to public funds, and that would mean the business would be fined. The business could lose its license, and obviously it means monetarily a loss to the company, because the HR department has failed to make proper checks in terms of making sure that the employee or the person they are employing in a particular job or a role has the rights to work within the UK. So these are things which HR department is tasked with in terms of the key functions of human resources management or department within the company. Now, in order to explain some of these, I have put together 1 or 2 slides, and these then give you further detailing in terms of the recruitment process and selection process. Now, if I look at the recruitment and selection process, I can detail it out. How would the recruitment process essentially work? So if I look at a recruitment process, assuming let's all, you know, all on the session today, wear the hat of an HR manager. So I want you to creatively think now that I work as a human resources manager in a company like, say, LITC, which is a training provider. And what I would be required to do is the management has given me the instructions to recruit, say, 2 teachers now and 2 administrators. So you are required to do this recruitment by end of September. Now, assuming this is the responsibility given by the management, how would you go about doing the process of recruitment and selection? So just think creatively by wearing this hat. How would you go about, you know, recruiting people which are required to, say, perform a particular role within the, you know, training provider or the organization? So you can unmute your microphones, and obviously let's look at doing a quick bit of discussion in terms of the process of recruitment and selection. So how would you start? Where would you start? What are the things are, you know, main bits of actions that you would take? Anybody? Any thoughts in terms of how this would happen? Okay, so when you look at recruitment and selection, assuming I was looking at recruiting, you know, say recruiting for administrators, as I mentioned, and tutors. So what I would do is, first of all, I would start with creating a job description. What is the role? What is the description of the job? What are the key functions which the person is expected to perform in this role? Then what you will do is you will maybe look into, you know, any CVs which are already within the organization, people who have applied to the organization before, and see if there are people that you can offer employment to. Then what you would do is, if you do not have any relevant CVs, then you would put this out as an advert, put an advert out for this job vacancy. So where would you put the advert out, or there's a job vacancy? This advert, you will place it on, say, Indeed, some of the job portals, as I would say. You might even go to a recruitment agency to say that if you have a recruitment agency or a retained agency, you might give them the job description and say, we're looking at this particular role. This is the, circa or the remuneration we are looking at paying. And then you would advertise, and then you would basically, get some shortlisted CVs, for which you will then schedule what is called interviews. Now, once the interviews are done and the shortlisted candidates accept the terms and condition, then what will happen is you will issue contracts, and these contracts, along with the job description, or JD as I call them, will lead to what is called induction or enrollment within the organization. They will undergo some basic training to get used to the organization, vision, mission, go through the employee handbook, things like that. And once this is done, the person would actually start his job or her job role. Now, when we look at this as an option, you would also have a bit of what is called, probationary period or probation. So of 4 to 6 weeks that you will basically be checking the candidate. You might go back and look at checking, some references. And then after the probation period is over, the employee will become a permanent employee of the organization, and they would start to work within a particular department or, a particular location. Now, this would be a process that you would generally follow through when you look at the employee recruiting somebody within the organization, and that would be a process of recruitment and selection. Now, when we look at training and development, there are lots of things which companies do in terms of training and development, and this is predominantly done from a short-term oblique long-term perspective. Training tends to be short-term, development tends to be long-term, and training is normally done to make sure that you are able to, say, for example, get some know-how, get some skills. And development is done primarily to ensure that you are able to gain experience over a point in time by either shadowing somebody, following somebody very closely. And this allows you to then become a part and parcel of a bigger team, and allows you to take up higher responsibilities, within the organization. So training tends to be more related to the role that you're doing within the organization, so that you're able to perform the best in terms of efficiency, performance within the given role. And development tends to be company preparing you to take up more responsibility or a bigger role, or maybe towards a strategic objective that they have in mind for the employee as the employee grows and performs within the organization. We talked about compensation and benefits. They tend to be about salaries. They tend to be about bits and pieces which are related to employment rights, looking at benefits that you would get, say how many holidays you would get, what would be the terms and conditions in your contract, what is your basic salary, what is your pension, what would be your incentive. All those things are a part and parcel of discussing compensation. Now, at a senior level, employees do also get what is called bonuses or incentives, and at a management level they might be also eligible to getting employee stock options or stock options if the main qualitative objectives of the organization are met at the end of the year. So when you look at companies, big companies like Elon Musk for Tesla, Tim Cook for Apple, you look at some of the big companies that we talk about, there the management or the founders or the chairman or CEO, whichever is the topmost position, you would generally see that these executives normally get a basic salary package, but they also get what are called stock options, because the company's share is doing quite well. The company is showing growth in the market. They are taking market share away. So qualitative targets are set by the management and the board. And this allows them to get, shares and, let's say incentives, which are going to be once the objectives are fulfilled at the organizational level. Now, when we talk about certain acts and legislation, there are lots of different types of acts and legislation that we will need to look at. Now, there are a few that I have, created here in terms of a timeline, and these are the basic ones that most HR department and organizations have to follow. So we look at the Equal Pay Act of 1970. We look at the Sex Discrimination Act, or essentially a discrimination act which was created by the government in 1975 and 1986. It was updated. We have the Race Relations Act. We have the Disability Discrimination Act, and then the Employability Equality Regulation Act of 2003. Now, in addition to this, there are lots of different acts which have been introduced, things like the Minimum Wage Act of 1998, which basically talks about what is the minimum wage that employees will get within the organization if you're working as an apprentice, if you're between an age group of 16 to 17, 18 to 20, or anybody who's over the age of 24. Now, these are minimum wages which employers are expected to pay. And if you're not getting this wage, or if you're not being paid, then obviously employees can, take this to the ACAS and report the employer to ensure that, they are being paid a fair amount of wage, which has been prescribed, by the government as per the living, standards in the country. So obviously, as you can see, the inflation is rising and rising steeply. Currently, I think it stands at 13.5%, and a lot of members like the barristers, the rail union, and the Royal Mail, a lot of other public sector employees are actually protesting and balloting and obviously striking, because they feel that if they get 3%, 4% rise, that is not good enough to meet the requirements of a wage rise that they are supposed to get, keeping in mind that the inflation is hovering at 13.5%. So that generally does not seem fair, and this is being looked into by the government. So when we talk about various acts, we look at one of the basic acts, which is the Minimum Wage Act, and we should be aware that this is the Minimum Wage Act, minimum wages that workers, employees, staff need to be paid if they're working for an employer within the UK. Now, there is an Equalities Act, which is, again, some of these are theoretical, which we need to understand and go through. So there's not much of discussion that I can do, but this is an Equalities Act which was created by the government, and what it means is when an employer, for example, advertises a job advert. Now, if I'm looking at advertising a job advert for a receptionist, I cannot say that only female candidates apply. Now, if I do this, basically there are two acts that I'm actually not following, and the business is liable to be fined by the government, because one, I'm not giving a fair chance to males or male staff or members to be able to apply for this role. And the second is I'm doing discrimination by only specifying that I want female only candidates to apply for this particular role. Now, this is something that cannot be done. And obviously the government mandates that all organizations, employers follow this basic act and legislation to ensure that people are not differentiated on the basis of their gender, their age, their religion, their beliefs, their culture, and their sexual orientation or the background they come from. And in those cases, all employers need to ensure that they are following what is called the Equality Act. Now, when we talk about discrimination, there are lots of different meanings of discrimination. Now, when we in general look at the word discrimination, what do we mean by the word discrimination? Now, if I look at the meaning of the word discrimination, Oxford Dictionary meaning basically says you are being unjustly or prejudiced primarily because of your background, your race, your religion, and especially on the basis of these 4 or 5 characters, which is race, religion, sex, or disability. Now, if I have somebody who's applying, for a job role, say for the position of an administrator, and obviously if the person is disabled or on a wheelchair, has a bit of disability, and then I say that, sorry, I can't take you on because you have a disability, and we would not be looking at taking candidates on. Now, in those cases, the person who's recruiting or the organization on behalf of which the person is recruiting is actually directly discriminating, and this is not allowed. Now, in this direct discrimination tends to be, discrimination which is basically imposed, by your boss, or when you work within an organization and you generally feel that the reason why this is happening is because you are being unfavorably, or unjustly not favored. Or let's put it this way, wherein a rule or a policy essentially applies to everyone, not in the same way. So it could have, the rules apply to you in a particular way and then applies to somebody else in a different way. Now, this could be a form of what is called indirect discrimination. So when we talk about indirect discrimination, we need to be very clear that indirect discrimination tends to be, a discrimination or a policy wherein the same policies do not apply to a group of individuals, and they feel disadvantaged because of the policy interpretation or the process being interpreted in a different way, depending on, who you are, where you are from, and, basically your background, race, and culture. Now, if I say that working hours for, people who are males in the organization is from 8 to 5 o'clock, and I say working hours for females or female employees in the organization is between 10 to 4, then if this is a one-off thing that you are doing because of holidays, or you're trying to make adjustments in order to create shift patterns, then that would be okay. And if you explain that to employees, that would be okay. But if this becomes a permanent pattern that, when you employ male employees, they are expected to work longer, or female employees are expected to work shorter, then this could be a form of indirect discrimination. And this is also not allowed as per the Government Discrimination Act of 2010. And if an organization cannot give a good enough reason of why this policy has been implemented, or how it has been interpreted differently for different employees doing the same amount of work within the organization, this would be termed as indirect discrimination. Now, one of the good examples that I would give you, which I think you would be able to relate to, is when we talk about Equal Pay Act. You see that in BBC, which is a semi-governmental organization, you see that the pay which male anchors and female anchors receive, there's a bit of difference. And a couple of years back, you would see that this was raised, and a lot of people resigned from their positions because they felt that I do the same job as somebody else does, but because I'm a female, I get paid less. And this was a form of indirect discrimination. So BBC has corrected that by revealing and publishing the pay of top 50 of its employees. And at the same time, the pay structure has now been regularized, and there is no differentiation in terms of the pay if a male or a female anchor is doing the same job, or, having the same role, and they are getting paid similarly. And this, if it is done in an organization, could be a form of indirect discrimination. Now, when we talk about trade unions, trade unions are basically an organization of workers which are created to be able to protect the interest of its members. And the union essentially looks at negotiating agreements, or agreements to be able to negotiate equal pay and working conditions for all employees within that organization. Now, I don't know, in terms of, I'm pretty sure that you would have heard of different types of unions in the UK. Now, if I talk about different types of unions, and currently they are all in the news because lots of different workers from different, public sector organizations are striking, things like workers from Royal Mail, Train Union, the RMT. You look at the Barristers Union, which have now decided to, strike. Now, there are lots of different unions because these are organizations created to be able to, let's say, represent the interest of their members, which are employees of different organizations. And you can become a member of any trade union that you wish to do so. And then the unions, essentially, because of the membership, they look after, and then they provide you certain benefits if you feel if you feel that you have not been dealt with fairly, or if you're not getting paid fairly, or there is, say, for example, discrimination happening, and if you feel the employer is not able to take action, then you can go to the union as a member of that union and ask the union representative to represent your case, and obviously put the facts in front of the employer and negotiate and discuss a best possible resolution for you. Now, there are lots of unions in the UK. Obviously, you have the trade union, the Unite Union, the Union of Rail and Maritime, RMT as we call it, Transport Union, and Teachers Union. There are lots of different unions, and depending on that, what you can, as a employee do is become a member of these unions. And at some stage, if you feel that you have not been dealt with a fair hand, then obviously you can take the matter to unions, and they would then look at going to the Arbitration and Conciliation Service, which will essentially look at putting the facts forward, and then in some cases accord compensation and get you the fair, look at getting fair treatment for you as an employee working for that employer. Now, a trade union typically tends to collectively bargain because of the fact that there are lots of workers which are a part of that union, and any such action which the union takes is done by balloting. That means they will go back to its members, they will ask them to vote, and if the balloting and the voting or voting tends to come back saying that yes, most members are agreeing to doing strike because they are not happy with the raises in wages which they are being given, then the unions can strike, and then on that point, unions representative then go and negotiate with the employers on the demands of the employees to see what reasonable solution can be addressed or arrived at, and that is where unions would come in and obviously play a vital role. Now, unions also have what are called, sometimes you would see that there are also called industrial tribunals. Now, these industrial tribunals are basically set up, primarily to ensure that, when we talk about the industrial tribunals in the UK, there is an employment tribunal. If you feel that you have been unfairly dismissed, you feel that there has been discrimination against you in the organization, you feel that there have been unfair deductions of wages or your wages by the company, then in those cases you take these matters to what is called the employment tribunals. And the employment tribunals, basically are responsible for ensuring that you are getting what is called a fair treatment from your employer. And in some cases, these employment tribunals also look at, getting you compensation or claims because of the fact that you have not been dealt a fair hand by the employer. Now, these tribunals are independent of the government, and they will be looking at working on your behalf as a claimant, and the person who is basically, making, let's say, a claim, they will then even require, they will basically follow a grievance procedure, and they will take it to court if required to get you the fair, let's say, resolution because of whatever reason. So they tend to be generally of 3 different types. And when you look at, you've received unlawful treatment on the basis of, say, being dismissed or asked to resign from your job, you have been discriminated against, and that is something which the organization has not looked into or failed to look into. And sometimes when you see that if you are being discriminated against on the basis of your caste, race, gender, background, and that leads to discrimination in terms of pay and wages, then these industrial tribunal, you would now then go to an industrial tribunal, and they would then be looking at putting your case forward in the court in order to, give you advice, and obviously in some cases also look at filing for claims and compensation. Now, one of the bits that I mentioned to you was the ACAS. ACAS is the Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service. This was obviously background-wise formed in 1896. The name and the structure of this particular organization was revised in 1974. And what we generally get to see is that when we talk about ACAS in particular, ACAS is responsible primarily for ensuring that, employees, and when we talk about, any sort of discrimination which has happened, then ACAS is the, the body to go to, a public body, of the government to go to, and its purpose is to make sure that organizations, improve in terms of providing facilities to its employees and making sure that the work-life balance and, no discrimination or no employee within the organization is, gets a unfair, dealing. So their main aim is to advise, and the advice tends to be on pay, wages, dismissals, employment contracts. They also look at reconciliation or conciliation essentially. So when we talk about conciliation, they act as an arbitrator in between the employer and the employee, and they do mediation. And this mediation, conciliation tends to be methods. They have different methods and procedures to be able to resolve disputes so that these disputes do not flare up and don't lead into what are called industrial relation or go to industrial tribunal. And then when we talk about arbitration, they basically look at ensuring that these disputes are decided in favor, and they look at both the sides of the arguments, and then they would advise and provide mediation service to be able to assist both sides of the parties to look at settling the dispute. And that is where, when you look at ACAS in particular, this has become pretty much, a very important body, which basically looks at resolving disputes between employers and employees. Now, this is the website. Obviously, there is lots to cover in ACAS. An idea would be to try and get a basic idea right now by looking at going to the website, because this service, you have to go, you normally would go to this service to look at dispute resolution and any sort of dispute which could arise because of pay, unfair dismissal, discrimination would be, and if this is something which cannot be settled within the organization or by the employers with the employee, then you would then seek help of ACAS, and they would then mediate, provide advisory, and then help you resolve this dispute with your employer. We talked about employment, performance appraisals. One of the key areas when you look at, HR's role, they look at doing appraisals. There could be different types of appraisals which are done, within the organization, and a few that I would list along with, something like a performance appraisal, which is done normally towards the end of the year. Apart from that, there are lots of different types. And these appraisals tend to, like 360-degree feedback appraisal, wherein if the company is also taking feedback from suppliers, customers about your performance within the organization, how you've, worked within your role, then this tends to be what is called the 360-degree feedback. This is something that is seen in hospitality sector. If you go on a holiday, and you stay at a hotel, and while you're checking out at the hotel, towards the end of your holiday, you're normally served a feedback questionnaire. And what the feedback questionnaire then tends to do is ask you about, how was your experience with the laundry department? How was your experience with the front desk? How was your experience with the, let's say, for example, the coffee shop? And how was your experience in general of staying with the hotel? So they are taking feedback in different areas to ensure that that feedback from the customer's mouth is captured. And if there are any gap areas, then, they are looking at picking up those gap areas by looking into these surveys or feedback questionnaires. And they tend to be what are called, 360-degree feedback, because they're taking feedback from the customer on all various departments of the company or people that you interacted with during your course of stay. And that tends to be, 360-degree appraisal or feedback. Now, there are other various types of performance appraisal techniques like management by objective, which is normally done, by set. Let's put it this way. This is normally for the management within the organization, because they are given qualitative objectives, things like getting market share or improving market share, improving the price of the share value of the company on the stock market, looking at customer acquisition. So these are qualitative targets which are set, which management needs to achieve over a period of time. They are not short-term targets. 12 months, 15 months, 18 months, 3 years, 5 years. One of the targets which a lot of CEOs of organizations today carry is sustainability, reduction of waste material, recycling, reduction in terms of carbon emissions. These are targets which are carried by founders, chairmen of the company like Marks and Spencer, all the senior most employees. And in this case, if they meet those objectives which have been set, then their appraisal tends to follow what is called management by objective. There is also something called balance scorecard. This is also, performance appraisal technique, which was introduced by Robert Kaplan in the 1950s. And this primarily is let's say an appraisal technique, which primarily looks into evaluating the performance of the employees, on 4 basic aspects related to the company. So this tends to be done on, looking at customer relationship, looking at the financials of the organization, looking at whether the employee is following internal processes to be able to do day-to-day responsibilities, and what is the growth the organization is having because of the involvement of that employee in that particular role. So these are all different forms of appraisal techniques that we need to be aware of. And these are, key areas which HR would look into depending on the size and scale of the organization. Now, some of the other, acts that we need to look at is Discrimination Act, which is obviously, no employer is expected to, if you feel that you're being separated out, or you've been, let's say, you have been, don't want to use the word alienated, but if you have been, let's say, looked at from a point of view of your background, your race, color, ethnic origin, then in those cases, that tends to constitute what is called discrimination. And discrimination tends to be when you're treating a person unfavorably or less favorably without any justification. And similarly, discrimination on the basis of disability is also not allowed. That sometimes you would see government bodies are required to, also put up a notice on their website or outside their premises that this premises is suitable for disabled people. That means that this premises has what is called the D1 permission and a wheelchair access, which is available throughout the building for the person to be able to travel. So things like people who are disabled, when you go to the bank, you see hearing in loop at the teller, at the counter when you go, and that hearing in loop is primarily installed to ensure that if you are having a disability on hearing, then you can actually put, your microphone or connect your device into the hearing in loop, and that allows you to do away with the disability, because then in that case, it allows the person to fully interact with the teller or the person on the other side of the bank from which you are taking a service. So you cannot, in some public places and in other locations wherein members of public need to go and have access to these services, employers are advised to follow certain guidelines, and this could be like a hearing in loop installed, primarily for people which have disability on hearing. Now, there is also something called the Employment Relations Act. This is where, there has to be a parity on treating workers, whether they work part-time or full-time. That does not mean that part-time workers don't get any wages or don't get any benefits. Their benefits tend to be on a pro rata basis, depending on the number of hours or days that they work for the organization. And this particular act ensures that, all people working within the organization are treated fairly. So things like parental leave, it used to be what is called maternity leave, 26 weeks. Now, most organizations offer what is called a paternal leave. That means 26 weeks can be taken off by the mother post her, delivery, and 26 weeks can be taken off by the father as a paternal leave. And this is what most organizations are expected to adhere to when we talk about the Employment Relations Act. Then we have the Employment Act of 2002, which looks into various things like paternity leave, adoption leave, dispute resolution, and equal pay structure for the employees. Now, there are lots of different other acts which typically I'll go through very quickly, like the Public Interest Disclosure Act, or PIDA as we call it. This basically looks at ensuring that any sort of malpractice or any sort of irregularity which is found within the workings of the organization can essentially be reported. And in this case, generally you would see sometimes employees within the organization act as what are called whistleblowers. And whistleblowers basically tend to be employees within the organization, but what they do is if they feel that the organization is not following the rules and regulation and they report it to the relevant government authorities, then that person is basically called the whistleblower, and the company cannot go after the whistleblower because the whistleblower has actually disclosed what is being not followed in terms of rules and regulation. So here in the Public Interest Disclosure Act, what happens is that the government protects the whistleblower from any sort of negative treatment or unfair dismissals or malpractices within the organization just because they have exposed the organizations of wrongdoings or not following the rules and procedures. Does not mean that they need to be discriminated against and they should be dismissed from the organization. So this particular act actually looks at protecting the interests of the whistleblower so that the employers cannot put any detrimental, provide any detrimental treatment to the, employee who's basically exposed, the information to the public. Now, there are lots of different things that I've spoken about in terms of the HR. And when we talk about Discrimination Act and we look at dispute resolution and the ACAS procedure, you're looking at, unfair dismissal, constructive dismissal, and, contracts of employment which are drawn up. And they tend to be, if you feel that the contracts have clauses which are not fair in terms of their expectation, from you and your duties that you're expected to perform, then you are able to take this to the ACAS process and then have the amendment amendment done in the contract because they are indirectly or directly discriminating against you by adding clauses or terms and conditions to those contract, which mean that the employer expects or provides unfair treatment towards your side. Now, there are certain other acts that we look at, and some of these are labor relations acts of pre-1980. They have now been superseded by, new acts or amendments which have happened by the government in the Parliament. And obviously, some of these that we look at, from a point of view of UK in particular, are listed here. So when we talk about employment rights in particular, we look at these main acts that we need to be aware of, things like the Unfair Dismissal Act or the Industrial Relations Act of 1971, contracts of employment, rights that have to be discriminated against. You look at the 2-pay, which is primarily, a regulation which was introduced because of the European, acquired right directives. And this particular act in the UK, basically looks at transfer of undertakings. When we look at protection of employment, when companies and companies directors essentially, look at taking ownership of certain organizations. So when we talk about 2-pay regulations, they are essentially there to protect the rights of an employee when you transfer the employee to a new employer. For example, if the company is being taken over by another company, when mergers and acquisition happen, then protection of employment, contracts need to be issued, and they are generally issued under what is called the 2-pay or transfer of undertakings regulation Act of 2006, and which was amended in 2014. Now, so what I would do essentially is to discuss, these in particular. What we have to do is look at getting to read some particular small handouts. And one handout which I would provide on the Moodle is going to be the employment legislation handout. And this particular handout would cover some of these main acts which are required to be understood from a point of view of employment legislation in the UK. Now, why are they useful and what benefits they provide are typically covered when you understand the contracts in detail. So things like employment tribunals, unfair dismissal, you look at, pay disputes. These are basically benefits of unions to the employees, because you can have a union, as a member of a union, you can have the union represent your rights and fight for your rights because there is unfair, treatment being vetted towards you. And if the organization does not look into these allegations or these charges themselves, then you have the ability to be able to take it to an independent arbitrator, and that would be through the ACAS service or through the unions. So these are benefits for employees. Now, what are the benefits for employers? Obviously, creation of employment contracts, some of the following of this legislation also protects the employers, because employees in this case cannot unfairly treat the employer or take the employer to an employment tribunal if they have been following these laws, acts and legislation as far as employability is concerned within the organization. So obviously it goes in favor of protecting the employer. That means the interests of the organization and the company itself, because they are following the law and legislation prescribed by the government in that country. Now, what we need to be able to do for the distinction task is primarily look at discussing these employment legislation in regards to a named country. So that is where I would suggest that when we look at discussing individual employment relations or rights, this particular task will basically be looking at, if you discuss these acts in respect to UK in particular, this would help you, complete or achieve the distinction criteria. So in general, for today's learning outcome, because it talks about know the role of employment and employment legislation, what we have to do is look at studying this particular learning outcome theoretically, know the role of human resources department. So some part of it, might sound that we need to look at, I'm just kind of going through the slides and it's a bit of a monologue, but it is the case that wherein you have to theoretically go through some of these concepts to understand what is the role of human resources department, what is the employment legislation in the UK, how this benefits the employer and employees. And then you have to talk about them in a bit more detail to achieve distinction, which is to say, pick up a few that we've discussed from the PowerPoint slides and then explain them in context to a name country. That means you might look at an organization like you work for a charity like Christie, or if you work for LITC as an administrator, you think and wear the thinking hat, and then basically talk about these legislations from a point of view of you working within that company in England and Wales, and that would be covering some of the key legislations required to be discussed for employment. And this would help you accomplish the distinction criteria. There are some useful websites that I've listed here, which primarily will help you focus on understanding some of these acts and legislations, things like the Equality Act, the Discrimination Act, looking at the Minimum Wage Act, looking at the ACAS website, Arbitration and Conciliatory Service website, looking at some of the government acts and legislation on one place, which is under the Department of Trade and Industry. And these would form some additional reading that you could do primarily from a point of view of understanding this learning outcome, which is learning outcome 5. So I hope you found the session to be useful for today. And if there are any questions at this stage, I'll be happy to take. And I'll go and address some of these now. If you can, obviously ask them with regards to what we've discussed. So any questions at your end, Farhana? Any questions at your end, Shamraz? Any questions at your end, Murtaza? Any questions at your end, Mohsin? Any questions, Shabir? Any questions, Mudassir? Any questions, Haider? Any questions at your end, Raminder? Any questions at your end, Taylor? Any questions, Syed? Abdul? Adila? All right, okay, I've got some responses. You can also ask questions through the chat room, not a problem. And if you do think of any questions for today's session, what I will be doing is, as I mentioned, I'm going to be looking at uploading a copy of this presentation on Moodle and also a handout for you to understand the employment legislation, in particular the 7-8 employment legislations, which are important, from a perspective of understanding what a human resources manager in the department needs to comply with as far as the business or an organization is concerned. So if you think of any, and if you have any questions, you can also drop me an email at litc@ukversity.co.uk. And apart from that, I would be catching up with you tomorrow. And tomorrow we'll be looking at discussing the last learning outcome in this particular unit, which will be looking at the importance of customer service, for the organizational success. And that will hopefully bring an end for us on the discussions of this particular unit. So I'll see you tomorrow at 11, same time, to discuss learning outcome 6. Until then, take care and thanks for attending, and bye for now.